All right, the Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana, has decided to withdraw the exemption from reporting on irregular, fruitless and wasteful expenditure granted to state-owned power supply Eskom to allow for a period of further engagement and written technical input from all relevant stakeholders on the matter. Let's get some reaction then on this turnaround decision. We are now joined by accountant and economic and political analyst Khaya Sithole. Very good afternoon, good evening to you, Khaya. I'm used to working in the afternoons. Thanks for being with us.
Sure.
All right, let's talk about this then. So from the onset, the decision to exempt Eskom from reporting the full extent of the financial seemed irregular.
Yeah.
What was your sort of immediate reaction? And I think, and we'll talk about now this U-turn, but I want to talk about your reaction there. And I think the best place to start is to talk about your piece, which was titled, "Exemption Offers Breather, but Eskom Will Find New Ways to Suffocate." What did you mean by that? Can you just expand?
Yeah. So the intention behind the exemption seems to have been in order to enable Eskom to essentially split its reporting into two parts. The first part is the financial statements that we're all familiar with. The second part is the annual report, which many people don't bother to read. So what Eskom and the minister have done is that they've said, look, when it comes to irregular expenditure, especially historic irregular expenditure, we want to move that to the annual report rather than the annual financial statements. And the benefit or the upside of that is that when the Auditor General expresses an opinion on the financial statements, she will only have to focus on just the financial statements, and then the issues relating to irregular expenditures will then be deliberated on in the integrated report. And that simply means that the Auditor General can issue an opinion based on just the financial statements, and that's what Eskom will then present to its lenders and its credit rating agencies.
How does that help the situation? How does that help us? Who does it help?
Yeah, so in reality, it doesn't really get us very far because unfortunately, the very same people that the minister and Eskom have in mind, the credit rating agencies and the banks, always look at the holistic picture anyway. So for them, it doesn't matter whether you mention the irregularities up front or later on. They are duty bound to look at the whole picture. So it's not very clear whether this is actually going to get them very far. But the only reference point we have so far is that when it happened to Transnet, they moved from a qualified audit opinion to a clean one. So of course, they had argued that a clean audit opinion makes it easier for them to negotiate with lenders. It lowers their funding costs. And what they are selling to us is that if it's cheaper for Eskom and Transnet to borrow money, it's cheaper for us as a country to fund them.
So what I found interesting, Khaya, and I'm particularly interested in this part where you say, exemptions may just buy breathing room, and you made it as a general thing about SOEs that will quickly find new ways to suffocate themselves.
Yeah.
What did
so
you
the
mean
problem
there?
here is that even if the exemption is provided to Eskom, if you look at Eskom's audit report of last year, it actually mentions many more issues beyond just the question of irregularities.
Yeah.
So the issue here is that even if the exemption comes to pass, until Eskom sorts out a lot of its structural issues, a lot of its corruption, they're still going to get a qualification from the Auditor General. And the only difference is that the basis for the qualification will not be non-compliant with the PFMA. It will be issues relating to the corruption that may or may not exist. We know that the previous CEO alleges that the corruption is still going on. So if that's still going on, the Auditor General is still going to report on it, even if there is an exemption.
Yeah, and I wanted to get your reaction on what the SCOPA chairperson, Khaya Sithole, had to say on this. I mean, he had a lot to say today. He said that, firstly, he's not convinced that the Eskom exemption is withdrawal, and asked what is the status of withdrawn for now.
Yeah.
He also said something like, this is not a withdrawal that was done in good faith. It seeks to merely stop public probing and accountability. What do you make of what he had to say there?
So it's very clear that the minister has only withdrawn the exemption in order to correct it.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is that the minister and Eskom remain convinced that this exemption is necessary.
To correct or to, as Tango put it, do legislative gymnastics?
No. So initially the Gazette was incorrect. And I say that it was incorrect because when you read the Gazette, it referred to an exemption from the annual report. And the annual report is the full spectrum, including the financial statements. So that Gazette should have simply said that the exemption is in relation to the financial statements. So we have a problem with the wording of the Gazette first and foremost. So what will happen now is that after the consultation, National Treasury will then come back with the Gazette that says that this is the basis for the exemption and this is why we think it's necessary for this exemption to happen. I do have a problem though with the attitude of SCOPA, because if you think about it, when Transnet delayed its publication of its financial statements in 2021, and then they came back a year later with the clean audit reports, Transnet did disclose that that the reason we are able to get a clean audit report is because we received an exemption.
Yeah.
How SCOPA missed that and didn't ask the question of what that exemption meant and are now reacting like we are as if this thing is new to them is rather problematic.
So you wouldn't agree with what they're saying, where they're saying that we might find ourselves in a situation where, they then come back with a legitimized process or something that was wrong to begin with. You're saying, look, it was flawed in any case,
yeah.
But is there a situation where we can find that it comes back still flawed, but properly flawed, if I can put it that way?
It's definitely coming back.
Yeah.
And I think when it does come back, the difference here, which I had highlighted, is that all we had was just a few words that said, this is the Gazette.
Yeah.
Only when we saw the private correspondence between the minister and the chair of the Eskom board do we then understand the rationale behind it. But if you're going to issue a document and the only legally binding document doesn't have the type of substance that is necessary for people to say this is legitimate, well, you're going to face this particular uproar. So the next iteration of it will be much more detailed. It will still end up with a conclusion that says that we as the National Treasury have taken the view that Eskom deserves this exemption because of the issues that are unique to Eskom and unique to Transnet.
Yeah, you ended your long piece, but you corrected me. You said, no, it was just 8 pages. You end the piece by saying that the question that should be of greater interest to all citizens is whether we have entered into a phase of governance by exception rather than an era of exceptional governance. So I'm throwing that question back to you there.
So the problem here is that if the minister is of the view that all these entities that have issues with historical irregularities, in other words, irregularities that germinated long before these new incumbents started running those entities, if he's of the view that there should be a distinction between old irregularities and new irregularities, then he should issue a general directive that says to all companies and to all auditors that, look, if you get there and they say to you, look, this irregularity you're asking us about happened 10, 15 years ago, we don't know who was it, we don't know what their motivation, then that becomes a principle that says that this is how we're going to audit state-owned enterprises going forward. The fact that he's now leaving it to them to sort of raise their hands and say, we think we've got a case here, simply means that they're actually going to be burdened with many more of these applications. The Road Accident Fund, I can guarantee you, is already trying to figure out how they can get the same concession because they've got the same problems.
And you point to the fact that there's already precedents. So you're saying that we're likely to actually see more of this indeed happening?
Yeah, it's inevitable because every single board of directors now is going to say, well, actually, our problems are similar to what you've said are the basis for you granting the exemption elsewhere, so why don't we get the same concession? So it creates that sense of confusion because now we do not know what the parameters are. And in fact, until you actually ask National Treasury directly, you cannot understand why the Transnet was granted the exemption was granted. You will not understand why the Eskom exemption was granted. And that fact that we have to dig so much in order just to understand what the principles are simply means that there are no principles underpinning this process.
All right, Khaya, thank you very much for that, and indeed weighing in on this issue. We certainly do appreciate your input here on SABC News. That is Khaya Sithole, accountant and economist.